Well, it gives me great pleasure to actually have a chance to quiz, grill, and chinwag with my good friend Professor Greg White, who we founded the Centre for Health and Human Performance back in 2007, about quite a while ago, about 13 years ago now. We're a team of about 40 scientists and specialists in the area of elite human performance science and sports medicine. We don't just work with athletes; we work with people wanting to do kind of ridiculous things for charity, but we're most well known really also for applying that to the sickest people to help them through their greatest challenges as well. So whether it's the Marathon des Sables or getting through really typical cancer treatment, that is what we do at our place. And Greg is not a doctor. He is a doctor of physiology, and he works at Liverpool John Moores University as a professor. In and amongst all the other things that he's doing. I remember once very classically, he said to me, Jack, I can't come into work today because I'm swimming the Channel. The kind of life that Greg leads. But what we're going to talk about today is like how it is that we can really push our bodies to the limits. What does it take to do that, and is it good for us or is it in fact bad for us? We're going to use an illustration of one of the projects which we did at our institute, which was the 7 on 7 in 77 challenge. But before we get into that, maybe Greg, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we can talk about that challenge and how it applies to people that are not doing crazy things on every continent on Earth.
Well, listen, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, and it's great to chat to you, Jack. It's always a pleasure to have a chinwag. I think what you've just articulated is exactly what we do, and I think that what I guess my background, I was an Olympian and a sports scientist. I used to be the director of research at the British Olympic Medical Centre, and my fundamental role there was to enhance human performance at the very elite end of the spectrum. So I work with some of the greatest athletes on the planet to optimize their performance, to take them from the grass onto the podium and keep them on the podium. So incredibly complex to do that, particularly as sport has advanced so much, and actually what we know about sport and the science and medicine of sport is crucial. And then in 2007 we met. And it was, I guess to some extent, it was an epiphany, the fact that what we do with elite athletes is exactly what we can do with some of the sickest patients. And whether that is cancer patients, my specialty is in cardiovascular function, so with heart patients, pulmonary patients. And in fact, what we have done at the Centre for Health and Human Performance is effectively applied the knowledge that we have from physiology and translate that into pathophysiology and optimize the performance of people at one end of the spectrum, from cancer going through chemotherapy and pre-surgery all the way through to Olympic gold medalists. And I think that what we found and what we understand now is actually, albeit it is physiology to pathophysiology, actually the same approach can be used to enhance performance across that spectrum.
It turns out that if you treat even the sickest cancer patients like athletes, they do better.
Absolutely,
and it's not
right.
To run for a bus. Some of the work we've done with King's College Hospital has even shown cellular, genetic and epigenetic changes in individual cancer cells as a result of this thing called exercise. Now, I'm going to talk about an extreme exercise or activity event that we did just before. Well, in fact, I started plotting on my computer the exponential curves of cases of coronavirus outside of the Wuhan province whilst we were on this trip. Yep. And I knew at that point that this was going to be probably the last set of flights that we were going to take in a very long time. But let's talk about this this particular challenge. Greg, what on earth did we do here?
It looks frightening when you look at it like that. I mean, and you're absolutely right. The interesting thing is, I was chatting with somebody the other day that when we arrived back from this challenge, just literally a couple of days later, we went into lockdown in the UK. And so that tells you when this occurred, in sort of February into March. And what this challenge was about is it's a classic challenge. It's actually an annual challenge, which is organized and has become very much iconic. And that is the challenge is to complete 7 marathons on 7 continents. And what we were trying to do with this particular challenge was actually set a new world record. Now, the world record before we started was 137 hours to complete 7 marathons on 7 continents, and that includes travel. But what we set was really quite an audacious goal, and that was to try and do those 7 marathons in 77 hours, which when I say it out loud, it sounds absolutely ridiculous. But what we did...
3.5 days or less, isn't it? It's like, yes.
I mean, and when you consider that it's over 50,000 miles of flying on top of 7 marathons and the period of time it takes to run those 7 marathons. But as you can see there, we started the event in Cape Town. We didn't run a marathon in Cape Town. We didn't use that as our Africa base, but we used that to fly into Antarctica, into Wolfsfang, onto Wolfsfang runway in Antarctica. And the race effectively starts when you start the first marathon. So we completed our first marathon in Antarctica. Immediately from there, flew into Argentina, Argentina on to Panama, from Panama City into Madrid, Spain, Madrid into Oman, Madrid into Egypt for the Africa leg, Oman for the Asia leg, and then finishing off in Perth, Australia for the Oceania leg. And of course, thankfully, and because of the huge amount of work that was put in, both by the challenger Kyle Voigt and by myself and you, Jack, we completed that in 81 hours and 38 minutes to create a new world record. In fact, smashing the old world record, which was wonderful to do, and it feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah. Indeed, it really, really does. I can't imagine that was just less than 4 months ago. It honestly seems like a lifetime ago. Let's move on to the next slide. And this is the team. And talk a little bit to us about teamwork. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to slide this on. Let me give it a go. Maybe if I click here, is that right?
There we go. Perfect. Great. Yep. He's up, and that's the team. And
teamwork's critical, isn't it, Greg?
Teamwork is everything. I mean, I have a mantra, and that is that nothing great is ever achieved alone. And I think that is absolutely true. I think invariably what happens, I mean, we work within elite sport. I've looked after some of the greatest athletes on the planet, but also some of the most iconic challenges on the planet. And of course, what we do from a media perspective is that we focus on the performer. What we very rarely do is actually look at the team that lays behind it. And I can tell you that nobody has ever achieved anything great without there being an incredible team behind them, supporting them. And this is a small part of that team to some extent, because what you have to remember is that behind each of these individuals lies another team that is supporting them and allowing them to achieve what they're doing. And so this was really quite a small team for a very good reason, because actually it's firstly, size is money. But I think critically, actually, size on a challenge like this actually adds complexity, which invariably adds time. What you are trying to be is lean and mean as you possibly can in order to make sure that we contract the amount of time that we spend. So what we have here is right in the center with the beard, next to you with your beard, is Kyle Voigt, who was the challenger. He was the guy completing the 7 marathons. Obviously, me in the middle with him. I was completing the runs with him. You looking after the medical aspect and the health care.
Mostly your toes, Greg. Which
that's right. Yeah. And then on our right, we've got head of logistics, and then right in the center is the film crew, and what a fantastic film crew! Oscar-winning film director who actually documented the challenge from start to finish. So it was a very slender team, but for very good reason. And the key to that really is actually there's a sort of number of stages around teamwork, and obviously first one is to identify the team, make sure that you've got the right team who know exactly what they're doing and can actually support the challenge itself. Then of course it's actually making sure that team can function and that they can actually function together. And I think that what we had was a truly magnificent team. And I think all great challenges that are successful, invariably the team work incredibly well together. And this is absolutely true in this case. And then I think also one of the key aspects is to remember that every member of that team has to operate at 100%. They have to be absolutely on the ball on a continual basis in order for, the analogy is with a clock is that whilst some areas may seem like small cogs in comparison to the big machine, the bottom line is the big machine will not work unless all the cogs are working in unison and working at 100%. And so there is a massive level of personal responsibility for each individual to optimize their performance to ensure that the overall performance of the challenge runs smoothly.
And of course, that's not sometimes what we see in healthcare. We see it in elite sport, but not in healthcare. And that's what one of the key differences, I think, is not the difference in the medicines, but a difference in the mindset of the team. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is you and me on the first bit in Antarctica. Yep. It was cold, wasn't it?
I mean, one of the biggest challenges here, and it's something that we face on a continual basis with elite sport, is actually thermoregulatory function, thermophysiology, and coping with changes in temperature on a challenge like this was probably one of the biggest challenges that we faced. So here we've got a whole host of things going on. Number one is it's minus 10 degrees centigrade. Now that is problematic from a health perspective. Interestingly enough, it's actually quite positive from a performance perspective, because hypothermia is one of our big problems during physical activity, not necessarily following the completion of it. But from a health perspective, non-freezing cold injury and freezing, so frostbite cold injury, is a real issue in these temperatures, particularly when you consider that the air temperature is minus 10. But with wind chill, that dropped to somewhere closer to minus 30 for this particular marathon. And of course, the first things to go are nose, ears, fingers, toes. And actually for men, and again, there's a lot of men on this project, the penis is the first thing to freeze on a man. So making sure we stay safe is absolutely crucial. If you add on top of that, you can see that we're wearing very dark glasses. The radiant load, both in terms from the sun, but also the reflective load coming off of the very white surface of the snow, can lead to snow blindness very rapidly. Very difficult to come back from snow blindness in a short term when it comes to these type of challenges. So really, the performance and health aspects of a challenge like this run parallel and are absolutely crucial to success, to make sure that you're optimizing both health and performance.
We're going to whiz through this now, Greg. So I've got the next thing I've got to show you. This is my favourite photo of the whole trip. Actually, this was you.
Wolfgang, yeah.
2 miles away in Wolf Fang. It was beautiful there. And then the next thing I've got here is this is actually when we reached Argentina, which was very beautiful. Then we flew from Argentina to Panama, where we'd gone from minus 10 to plus 40. That's another example of how, I mean, that's when the challenge nearly ended, because I don't think anyone has really ever gone from 90% humidity, gone into 90% humidity, 40 degrees centigrade from minus 10 completely dry in less than 8 hours, that was a very moment.
And you raise a really important point there, Jack, actually, particularly from a health perspective, is that, in a relative humidity of under 20%, which is in Antarctica. I mean, it's they call it the white desert for a very good reason. It's incredibly arid. And of course, what that does during exercise with high ventilation rates coming through the mouth, you get two things. One is you get very rapid fluid loss. You've got, as well as having what's called cold-induced diuresis. So in the cold, blood pressure rises. And so what we do through diuresis is we excrete more fluid. But also you get a lot of insensible sweat loss through breathing. So what you're trying to do is constantly humidify very arid, dry air. And what that does, it means that you're losing an awful lot of fluid, number one. Number two is that what you do is you actually create a potential for cold injury to the lung. And what we know is that if you drop below minus 26, what you can do is get ice crystal formation on the inside of the lung. So you get what's called endothelial lung damage at very cold temperatures. So there's a real health issue, but also a performance issue when it comes to hydration. And then within a 24-hour period, I mean, this is the thing about a challenge like that, within a 24-hour period, and having already run 2 marathons, so you've got fatigue in terms of physical fatigue, you've got psychological fatigue, you've then got travel fatigue on top of that. And then what you're doing is you are challenging the thermoregulatory system of the body to its absolute maximum. You go from -10 stroke -30 with wind chill, 20% humidity, straight into +40 degrees centigrade. And when we started that run, I'm sure you remember, Jack, but when we started that run with head torches on at 5 a.m., you could actually see the water in the air. It was close to precipitation. It was that humid. So we're over 90% humidity. And it was, without any shadow of doubt, that image there of Kyle in Panama, that was make or break on this challenge. It was utterly brutal. And it was certainly, even having worked in some of the toughest places on the planet. I mean, I've run the Marathon des Sables, which is a 156-mile race across the Sahara Desert. You know, I have personally raced and I've supported some of the toughest challenges on the planet. But it was the difference between Antarctica into Panama, which I think was probably one of the biggest challenges I've ever seen.
We've got to whiz through now, Greg. Unfortunately, we're getting lots of questions as well. So this was the end result. This was the record time, which I'm very pleased my stopwatch on my iPhone didn't break. This is I think a nice. This is essentially the mood of the whole thing, me trying to pick up pieces and you having a big smile on your face most of the time. But of course, it was really challenging. I think even you yourself, who've done some of the most difficult challenges in the world, you know, you were pretty knackered at certain points, if I remember.
Oh, brutal. I mean, it was brutal. You know, and again, what I think what's interesting, and again, this sort of tracks into some of the healthcare work that we do, Jack, and that is particularly around things like sleep deprivation. And actually the critical and central importance of sleep when it comes to recovery, both in terms of physical recovery, but mental and emotional recovery. And of course, what you get on a challenge like this is that you replicate, to some extent, people who have significant sleep disorders. Because for 81 hours, we were in constant motion. We were attempting to get sleep in that motion. For very short periods of time. Some of those flights were very, very short, less than 4 hours. So we had less than 4 hours between marathons. So coming in physically and mentally pre-fatigued, very short periods of sleep, and then trying to run a marathon again. So I think, you know, and it's interesting actually that there is this crossover between what we're talking about, elite performance or you know, almost super physiologic performance. And tracking that back, exactly what we do in the clinic on a daily basis, and tracking that into pathophysiology, the links really are there.
Yep, this is another aspect of feeling well and getting through illness. Food. So food was interesting on this trip because we were entirely vegan. We were entirely plant-based from end to end. The reason being that the film crew and Kyle Vogt himself, they were the executive producers of a film called Game Changers. And so one of the purposes of this trip was to show that you can do the 7 on 7 and you can do it in a world record time, eating entirely vegan food. And I have to admit, well, this was, I think, on the 4th leg, which was where? This was in Oman. No, Egypt, I think. And Egypt, yes. I absolutely loved it. I mean, I know you had hidden away a burger or something in your. I remember you feeling very embarrassed about wanting to steal away something that wasn't vegan. But no, in general, we had a good time. It was actually very doable, and I think there's some evidence that it does you no harm. I certainly don't think that you need much more than sugar and sleep during a trip like this, to be honest. But it was very good, and I certainly felt that Kyle recovered remarkably well. It would have been lovely to take in blood and seen what his inflammatory markers were like, but you know, it just shows that you don't need as much meat as we eat. Simple as that.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, Jack. I mean, you finish on perhaps the key point and potentially my key worry. I mean, you know, the idea that you can do things vegan, I think, is, of course you can. I mean, the interesting thing about vegan is that it's very high carbohydrate. And we know that during arduous exercise, carbohydrates are a critical source of energy. I think my biggest worry was actually around protein, was that actually the resynthesis of muscle requires protein. And of course, we know that we can get protein from plant-based source. There's not a problem with that. The critical difference is that actually the volume of food that's required to get the same the same amount of protein. That's our key problem. And of course, in normal daily life, we can move around that. The problem on a challenge like this is that invariably the drive to eat is depressed, is suppressed with arduous exercise. So with fatigue, physical and mental fatigue, often what we don't do is we don't eat enough. And so therefore, when you're asking people to eat even more because they need a greater volume to optimize protein intake, then that can become a little bit of a worry. That said,
well, if you've only got appetite for one mouthful, you have to
optimize that mouthful. And that's the key to it. But I think, that said, what we were was very inventive around it. And what we know is that there is a whole host of different plant products that we can actually get protein from. And I think what we did a great job in actually optimizing that protein, that bang for the buck, that mouthful of food to optimize protein intake. But again, it brings us back to this idea of healthcare and in pathophysiology. Is that currently I'm looking after a young lady who's got anorexia nervosa. And interesting enough, a lot of the approaches that we take with athletes in trying to refuel and optimize performance are very similar to the approaches that we would take with clinical cases.
Greg, this is us actually cheating before off. This was actually in Cape Town, and we were for a Pan-African meat feast.
It was.
Actually knows about. So
don't tell anybody.
Because we've got very little time. I just want to wrap up by saying this is another one of the crazy challenges that Greg got me involved with. What is this, Greg? Very briefly, what happened here?
That is probably one of the best days of my life that we're looking at there. In fact, this was for a show that we shot for the BBC, and one of the things that we were interested in was actually about post-injury recovery. So talking about the concept of rest, ice, compression, elevation. And to my mind, the best way to try and demonstrate that was that if we could get you into a cage fight with somebody who was about twice your size, who they called the headhunter, to beat you up until eventually I threw the towel in. I thought actually it was the end at one point. But it was, do you know what? It was. I think it was a fantastic experiment and actually demonstrated using MRI. Again, from a healthcare perspective, what we showed is the value of intervention in recovery from injury, because we left one leg effectively, very briefly, one leg was damaged, both legs were damaged, but one leg we treated, one leg we didn't treat, and showed that what we could do is accelerate recovery with the right approach. I'm not sure we needed to have you in a cage, but it certainly made my day.
I didn't need to have 2 broken ribs either, but that's why, ladies and gentlemen, that is why working with Greg for the last 13 years feels like this. Yes, one of our clients there on the left-hand side, a good friend of ours who's done a lot of comic relief, sport relief challenges. So I hope you can understand that it's wonderful working with Professor Greg White, but it has there are challenges. Literally,
ups and downs.
Greg, thank you very, very much. We have some questions. We don't have a lot of time. We have loads of questions. Guys, production team, are we supposed to answer these questions now or in the Q&A session? Because there are about 30 of them. Let me know. There are ones including what level of training will have an effect on heart cells for a fit but older, an older person with cancer, and a fit and older 60-year-old. I've got hypertrophic cardiac myopathy. Is this why my consultants are always getting me to walk on a treadmill with ECG stickers? What techniques did you use to push through the most challenging aspects of your performance? Yeah, I mean, there are lots of them here. I don't know if we've got time. This could be a whole half-day session. We've got 2 minutes. Let me choose. I'll choose one of them, which was what were fancy eyeglasses with the teal lights? Yes, that was a retimer. Retimer is a 446 nanometer wavelength light that is in sunlight, but not in fluorescent bulbs, and it basically suppresses melatonin. So by doing it, you feel less sleepy. It resynchronizes your body clock. We needed to do that to optimize our sleep throughout the trip. So that's that answer. And Greg,
let me take that because I actually did my PhD in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
Right, you go to that. We've 1 minute left, and then we have to go.
So very briefly, for those that don't know what HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is an idiopathic left ventricular enlargement which leads to fibrofatty infiltrate into the myocardium, which can act as islands of arrhythmia generation, so they can create arrhythmia. Interesting enough, when I started my PhD in the mid-90s, HCM patients, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients, were told not to exercise. We changed that around dramatically, and one of the things that I did for my PhD is we exercised HCM patients to maximum volitional exhaustion. What you always have to think about is exercise is absolutely fundamental to life, irrespective of what your pathology is. And what we use exercise for is to make sure that we can combat some of the pre-existing or coexisting diseases, things like type 2 diabetes, etc., so that we can optimize health, both immune health, general health, metabolic health. Exercise is fundamental, irrespective of pathology. What you just need is to make sure that you get the right prescription, which reduces risks, to optimize performance.
Before we wrap up, I just one question that somebody asked is, where do we find the cage fight on TV? If you Google,
it's on YouTube.
Triangle cage fight BBC, you will find it, and I will be hiding. And I can't. I can't watch. The person you'll hear giggling in the background, if you listen very carefully, other than Greg, is my wife. She thought it was hilarious.
And she's still paying me for the treat.
Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure to listen to both of you. I mean, absolutely incredible dynamic duo. So thank you so much to Professor Greg White and Dr. Jack Kreindler for this fascinating fireside chat, where they shared with you many adventures, challenges, absolutely incredible sporting feats, you know, the kind of 7 marathons, 7 continents, setting a new world record of doing all of that in 81 hours is just absolutely impressive. And I really liked your mantra, Professor Greg, about nothing great is achieved alone. And I think that's a kind of really powerful message to end this session on. So now, depending on the type of pass that you have, you'll be able to follow this incredible dynamic duo into a Q&A session. And the next thing that will happen on the next stage, actually in a couple of minutes, you will see me pop back again. We will have another fascinating conversation with Mark Davis, who's the Chief Medical Officer at IBM, and Parker Moss, who's the Chief Commercial Partnerships Officer at Genomics England. And the conversation will be about Genomics England and the unmasking of COVID-19. So very topical, and I'll see you back in a couple of minutes.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.